السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. حلف شمال الأطلسي أو الناتو منظمة مسلحة عازمة على توسيع رقعة أعضائها وانتشارها وسيطرتها، والمخاطر كثيرة. ظروف تشكيل حلف شمال الأطلسي وأهدافه وعولمة الناتو من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. أولئك الذين يحبون السلام عليهم أن يتعلموا كيف ينظمون أنفسهم على نحو مؤثر كما أولئك الذين يحبون الحرب. هكذا يقول مارتن لوثر كينغ جونيور. فقادة منظمة حلف شمال الأطلسي أو الناتو نظموا أنفسهم على أساس خوض الحروب، فهم يعشقون الحرب وأرباح ومكاسب السلاح جراء الحرب. بحسب المساعد السابق للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة دينيس هاليداي، سباق التسلح اليوم في ظل كل الإنفاق الهائل على السلاح، بينما العالم غارق في تدهور الأوضاع المعيشية ولا سيما ارتفاع نسب الجوع العالمي والفقر والبطالة، بات يسمم العلاقات الدولية ويكرس سوء القرارات المتخذة من قبل مجلس الأمن في الأمم المتحدة، ويهدد سلامة المليارات من مواطني العالم.
NATO's banner flies proudly.
حلف الناتو أبصر النور عام 49 من القرن الماضي بناء على معاهدة شمال الأطلسي التي جرى توقيعها في واشنطن من العام نفسه، واتخذ من بروكسل عاصمة بلجيكا مقرا لقيادته. وكان دور الحلف في فترة التأسيس تولي مهمة الدفاع عن أوروبا الغربية ضد الاتحاد السوفيتي والدول المؤلفة لحلف وارسو آنذاك في سياق الحرب الباردة. الدور الرئيسي لهذا الحلف هو حراسة حرية الدول الأعضاء وحمايتها من خلال القوة العسكرية، وهو يؤدي دوره من خلال الأزمات السياسية، وكل الدول الأعضاء فيه تساهم في القوى والمعدات العسكرية، ما أدى إلى إنشاء تنظيم عسكري لهذا الحلف. بيد أن للناتو أهدافاً أخرى وأجندة سياسية وعسكرية انتقائية. عالم الاجتماع الكندي والباحث في مركز أبحاث العولمة ومؤلف كتاب عولمة الناتو مهدي داريوس ناظم رعيا كيف يصف الظروف التي أدت إلى قيام حلف شمال الأطلسي والأهداف الرئيسية المعلنة والخفية لهذا الحلف العالي التسلح، وماذا عن المخاطر التي يمثلها الناتو بقيادة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية للسلام العالمي. Mehdi Dariush Nazim Roya, Canadian sociologist and research associate at the Center for Research on Globalization and author of The Globalization of the NATO. Welcome to the Inside, sir. Welcome to the Inside, actually from the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Thank you for having me. I'm very proud to be here in Syria and in Damascus, one of the centers of resistance.
Yes, our pleasure, sir. Now, the focus of our edition tonight is going to be around the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or also which is known as the North Atlantic Alliance, and which is perhaps the world's foremost military alliance. What can you tell us about the circumstances that led to the inception of this alliance back in April 1949?
To be very frank, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created by the signing of what's called the Washington Treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty is what it's called plainly, but formally it's the Washington Treaty, which was signed in the United States, of course. It was created after World War II. This organization is actually based on the post-1945, and I repeat, the post-1945 American occupation of Western Europe. You have to remember that at the end of World War II, the United States had many troops throughout Western Europe occupying different countries, including Germany and Austria, primarily Germany and Austria. And the United States had bases and troops alongside the Mediterranean. In Britain, in fact, the preamble to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is something called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was signed somewhere.
This is what paved the way for the NATO's inception.
The Atlantic Charter was a meeting during, before the U.S. entered the war with the British. It was talking about the post-World War II order, an Anglo-American world order after the war. And essentially, the British were surrendering their colonies to the United States. These are the conditions before NATO. Another thing I think I should mention is the United States is one of the last countries to get involved in the war. It let everybody in Europe and Asia kill each other first, destroy each other's industries. And who are the ones who suffered the most? Well, the Soviet Union and the Chinese. I want to mention also that this treaty is not really one of mutual defense. NATO was created on the pretext of mutual defense.
But this is what was mentioned in Article 5, which is mutual defense.
Yes, but do you think that Belgium...
That if one country is being assaulted or there was an attack against one country, all the countries or those members of the NATO should rise there in support and defense of this country's member state.
That is absolutely correct, but those are just the words of the treaty. The treaty means much more. It's actually an American guarantee, a nuclear umbrella over the rest of those countries. Do you think Belgium could come to the aid of France or Britain if they were invaded? Or France could come to the aid of the rest of these countries? No, they were all too weak after the war. It was a U.S. guarantee, essentially to give them an umbrella of protection.
So it was a dress tailored in the sense that it fits the American interests.
Of course, like I said at the start, it's the post-1945 occupation of Europe. It was legitimizing U.S. troops being in those countries. And let me add one thing is, in these countries, after the war, the communists, the socialists were the ones that were about to be elected in a lot of these countries, because a lot of the resistance movements were tied towards them. And the United States wanted to keep troops to also prevent these countries from becoming oriented towards the Soviet Union. In fact, before NATO was created, the Soviets wanted a pan-European security alliance, which included everybody. It's the United States that turned them down.
Yes, but allow us here to highlight some of these goals, because the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, stated in 1949 that the organization's goal was, quote, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. How do you explain such goals forming this alliance?
First of all, the man you're quoting is one of the people who helped divide India. Divide Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs, make them fight each other, just like how the Americans and British have done in the Middle East, like in Iraq. I'd like to point that out about him. Secondly, this man, what he meant by keeping the Germans down is we have to neutralize the Germans. We can never let them rise up and become a strong country. And keeping the Russians out of Europe, well, I would have corrected him if I lived back then. I would have said the Soviets, because Soviet Union includes Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Armenians, Azeris. Anyways, he meant we keep the Soviets out of Europe. We want to exclude them from Europe. They already had a project of exclusion, which is continuing today. They want to exclude countries like Russia from Europe. They want a Europe that's redefined in an Anglo-American model and in an Anglo-American shape, sculpted to the will of the United States predominantly.
And they got Turkey in, for example.
Of course they got Turkey. When NATO was actually originally formed, Iran was also a candidate. Iran, Turkey were candidates, but because of political reasons and other thoughts at the time, they kept them out. Turkey eventually does join at the same time as Greece. But this was it. It was basically to keep Europe within the orbit of the United States. We keep the Germans weak. We don't want them to become independent. That's why Germany was divided into East and West. And we don't want the Soviets involved in European affairs. We need them excluded.
What about the sister alliances of the NATO and the creation of the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact, which has a longer technical name, the Warsaw Pact is the name we call it commonly, but it's not the formal name, was created by the Soviets as a reaction to NATO. there was no Soviet aggression or Soviet threat in Western Europe, like I mentioned earlier. The fears of the United States and some of the elites in Western Europe was that the governments, people could vote for socialist, communist, or independent governments that were progressive. And they kept their troops there. NATO was created for one of the reasons it was created was for this. Of course, they always thought that there could be some sort of help from the Soviet Union to a new government. But the Warsaw Pact was a defensive reaction. And as I mentioned earlier, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Molotov, he said, let's unite Germany. First of all, he said, we'll unite Germany. And we can make a pan-European alliance, security alliance. And the United States and its allies turned the Soviets down. And the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, which includes Poland, the former
Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania,
exactly.
States back in 1955. What about the sister alliances of the NATO?
Well, the sister alliances of NATO explains what the United States is up to. If you look at where these alliances are, they're all encircling the Soviet Union and China, the People's Republic of China, essentially. One of them is alongside NATO. You'll see NATO based in Europe predominantly, if you don't think of just Anatolia or the Asian part of Turkey. The Baghdad Pact, first I'll tell you the members. It included Britain, Turkey once again, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. You can see that this alliance is bordering the Soviet South. The United States, for technical reasons, was only an associate member, but it did call the shots in this alliance. Later, Iraq, when it got a revolutionary government, withdrew, and this organization's name was changed to the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. And that says a lot on how the United States thinks.
Please tell us about the goals of having such kind of sister alliances to the NATO.
Well, before I do, I have to explain that there's also another sister alliance, which was called the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. This alliance included Britain this time, again, France, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, the United States, and its southern part of China. You can see by the name of the previous organization in the Middle East that the United States considered this a central front against the Soviets. So you can see the entire Eurasian landmass is being surrounded, encircled by these organizations that are tied to the United States. So the United States is creating a ring around Russia and China, the Soviet Union and China. I mean, the Iron Curtain is not the creation of the Soviet Union. The term comes from Churchill, but it's the creation of the United States by trying to encircle these countries and to choke them. And that's what these organizations represent. These two, the ones I mentioned, the CETO.
Where are these organizations nowadays?
Two of these organizations have been dismantled. CENTO was dismantled because the Iranians had their revolution in 1979, and it was effectively dead. CETO was dismantled much earlier because of the Sino-Soviet split between Beijing and Moscow, and because the Chinese made some agreements with during the Maoist end of the Maoist era with Nixon, and this led to the effective death of CETO. I want to also point out that at the same time that CETO was created, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was created to be an economic parallel organization to it, just like how the European community or the European Union has become a parallel to NATO, and you can see the expansions are tied to one another.
Right. Mehdi, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then when we come back we'll talk a bit more about the reinvention of the NATO after the Cold War. من الداخل سيعود بعد هذا الفاصل، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
عالم الاجتماع الكندي ومؤلف كتاب عولمة الناتو مهدي داريوس ناظم رعيا كيف يصف مقاربة وأعمال حلف الناتو قبل الحرب الباردة وبعدها.
Well, as we all should know, they used the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, or the Soviet Bloc countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, as excuses, as justifications for the existence of this military alliance. But after the Cold War, they had a dilemma. The Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact was dismantled. The Soviet Union dissolved into several different independent republics: Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the 3 Baltic republics, the 5 in Central Asia, the 3 in the Caucasus. There was no longer an enemy. In fact, in NATO terminology, official documents, the word threat was replaced with lower words. Words like potential threat, or words like rivalry. So the threat was taken out of the vocabulary of NATO documents. There was no longer a threat. The mandate of Soviet aggression was gone, and the true colors of this organization started to come out. It was very clearly an offensive organization after the... It showed itself very clearly to be a offensive organization. We can see from its actions in various countries that it hasn't operated offensively. And how has it justified this? Well, it's used mandates of peacekeeping, fighting terrorism, international policing and security operations. It's used new pretexts to get involved in wars. And I'd like to briefly mention that when the Cold War was ending, and they knew that the Soviet threat was about to go, there was no real Soviet threat, but when they knew that the Soviet Union was not going to be there to challenge them, a lot of dirt started to come out about NATO. For example, there's organizations, paramilitary organizations called stay-behinds, which are tied to it. And this is very well documented in Italy, for example, like Gladio, which were killing people or assassinating politicians like the Italian Prime Minister, which we all know is very well documented now, and blaming it on people in their own countries.
Allow me here in the sense, Mehdi, to go to something expressed by Mr. Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General. He said, quote, "The policies of the U.S. since the end of the Cold War are complicated and vast, and among what they include is the conversion of NATO into a surrogate military police force for globalization and U.S. world economic domination." And also, you've described in your book the relation between Russia and the U.S. as something like has been like a roller coaster drive. In this sense, what can you tell us about the project of the missile shield?
I endorse what Ramsey Clark said. I think it's very precise, very exact on describing what NATO is being used for, and I fully concur with him on that. The global missile shield, before I speak about it, I'd like to say that when the communist or socialist threat disappeared, members of the...
There has to be an enemy.
There has to be an enemy, and of course, before they started talking about this enemy, they gave a lot of indications, and then the Secretary General very frankly said that Islam, the Middle East, these are our new places to look at. These are the new enemies, the new places that are threats to us. These are the new places we need to get involved in. And they very clearly, American officials very clearly said that we'll get involved in places like Somalia, maybe even Congo. This was foreshadowing what the United States was planning on doing with this organization. And as I said, Iraq was the first place where they tested out NATO maneuvers, even before Yugoslavia. It was informal. They used all the alliance's resources. Then they went into Yugoslavia. And since then, they've been expanding. They've sucked in all the former Warsaw Pact countries, except for the ones that are ex-Soviet republics. So Poland has joined, the Czech Republic has joined, Slovakia has joined, and they've been putting bases on these countries and missiles, which are pointed at Russia. Why? If the Cold War is over and Russia's your friend, why are you pointing missiles at it? And I mean, it's clear now that the Russians and the Americans aren't friends, but that's not because that didn't happen overnight. The Russians tried to integrate themselves into the Euro-Atlantic orbit. And what I mean by the Euro-Atlantic orbit is I mean the American orbit in the United States. Euro-Atlantic is a camouflage word. It hides the word Americans.
The Europeans were afraid of the Russians, and they said that, are you going to get the wolf among us, the sheep? And you know, the Russians say that, no, we are the sheep and you are the wolves. We shouldn't be among you.
Yes, that argument has been made. And history proves who the real wolves are. Who are the ones who helped destroy Russia's economy? Who are the ones who helped wealth distribution be grossly mismanaged in Russia? Who helped Boris Yeltsin when he bombed the parliament? They said nothing about democracy when Yeltsin bombed the parliament. Everything they've done is to break up Russia. They've supported separatist elements in the Caucasus, specifically Chechnya. They've done everything to destabilize and break up the Russian Federation. And why? Because Russia is a rival to them. It was a potential rival, and it is a rival now. And because Russian capitalism is a threat to American capitalism. It's the same thing with the Chinese.
Mehdi, what are the circumstances that might lead to the NATO being dissolved?
It has to be internal. Members have to withdraw. It needs a defeat of some sort. There needs to be a psychological blow to them. I can't see it dissolving without that. The United States is actually pushing every single member of NATO to increase their military budgets.
And they talk here about that the creation of NATO brought about some standardization of allied military terminology, procedures and technology, which in many cases meant European countries adopting US practices, a total melting down of European countries in the US practices and goals.
Yes, Americanization is heavily tied to this process. When NATO expands, countries have to adopt NATO standards. And those standards aren't just military, they're political as well. And at the same time, this process is turning the elites in these countries essentially into American subordinates. A lot of them are increasingly being trained in the United States, tied to the United States, so we can't separate Americanization and cultural imperialism from the process. Cultural imperialism is a very important word here with Euro-Atlantic expansion. And I have to stress that Euro-Atlantic expansion means Euro-American. It means the United States. Europe is not the United States, and it's not the European Union. It's very wrong to also call the European Union Europe, because not everybody in Europe is part of the European Union.
Right.
Europe is a much more diverse place than the European Union and the Euro-Atlantic orbit. Although the United States and the European Union want to destroy any alternatives to the European Union and NATO in Europe, that's their mandate. They don't want any alternatives to it. So countries like Serbia and Ukraine that aren't part of NATO, they want to bring them in. They don't want the Eurasian Union that the Russians want to create. And I want to throw this word. The word Eurasian means Europe and Asia. And Europe and Asia are really one continent. They're not separate continents. It's a social construct. It's a political construct, actually. It's a political construct. They're one continent. They're next to each other. The people are intertwined. And Euro-Asia, Eurasian, means that these people need to be combined. They need to recognize their history together. And the Euro-Atlantic project is trying to destroy that. And that's why we see these rivalries against Russia.
Right. Now, Dennis Halliday, former United Nations Assistant Secretary General, in the foreword for your book, The Globalization of the NATO, it's a very precious book, and we advise everyone to have it, grab it, and read it, He said, NATO as it expands today is absolutely not what the world of struggling economies and deprived populations require. It is nothing but a negative force. It is undermining an already fragile United Nations. NATO has not been appointed policeman for the globe. It is self-serving, lacks integrity, has demonstrated its leadership cannot be trusted, and creates nothing positive, and that it needs to be abolished, as he said. How can one understand the dangers behind this American-driven alliance?
Well, there's an expression in English, it's called the proof is in the pudding. We have to see what they've done. They've helped destroy Yugoslavia. People's living standards have not gone up there. They've helped break international law. Under the ironically, it's in Orwellian terms. They're saying they're enforcing international law, but they're actually breaking it in every circumstance. In Kosovo, the Serbian province of Kosovo, more Albanians were killed by NATO than by the Serbs. How can this organization, which bombs hospitals in Yugoslavia or in Libya, which bombs universities, be thought of as a legitimate military organization? In Afghanistan, they've done many things, and because of the lack of a media coverage, lens there, media coverage, they've had free reign. I know members of the military who served in Afghanistan who say there's no rules of engagement in Afghanistan. Rules of engagement means we're free to do whatever we want. And we see the atrocious human rights records in Afghanistan. I should say NATO occupied Afghanistan. We should always refer to it as NATO occupied Afghanistan.
But they are going to leave in 2014, December 2014.
We have to see what they do. Don't believe what they say until they do it. I think that is the most secure way to look at it. I think they'll leave troops. Of course, Hamid Karzai, the mayor of Kabul, let's call him, the president of Afghanistan, he realizes the game. He realizes that the United States will throw anyone away, betray them. He's seen the negotiations with the Taliban, and I think that's given someone I consider to be, well, at least he was a puppet at the start. It's given him some strength to oppose the United States. Everybody's realizing the strategy the U.S. is using, like in Egypt, dividing, playing two parties against each other.
Excellent. Mehdi Dariush Nazim Roya, Canadian sociologist and research associate at the Center for Research on Globalization and the author of The Globalization of the NATO. Many thanks indeed for joining us on The Inside from Damascus.
Thank you for having me here.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadin.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل، من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين من دمشق. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.